Hey guys, welcome back. BDCKR here, and we're back with Season 8, Episode 18 of our weekly Q&A videos. We'll skip the stuff about the podcast. Check out the description if you want the information for what we're not going to talk about. But getting straight into the first question, I think, unless you have anything you want to talk about for the week. We have Mohammed Saqib, who says, how do I get good gear cards? I keep getting 1-star, 2-star, and 3-star.
And the funny thing is, to me, is that those actually are the good gear cards, right?
Yeah.
They're not the best, but once you get what you consider the best, which are the 4.5-star gears, right? So you're talking about 1-star that becomes 2, 2 that becomes 3, 3 that becomes 4, and the nomenclature that I've been wanting to push from the very beginning, because it's confusing to talk about that. Unless you're talking about 1-star or 5-star gears, it's ambiguous what you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
So I like to call them 1.5-star because they start off
Which is
at
1 becoming 2. Yeah.
And 2.5-star and 3.5-star. So those gears are the ones. So there's a lot of 3.5-star gears that are really good, and there's still a bunch of 1.5 and 2.5-star gears that are good in and of themselves as functioning as gears. However, even if you don't want to use them on your team, they give you shards to promote and fuse your 4.5-star gears. And you get those most often. They're the most common gears that you can get. So then it means that once you've made the investment to fully promote them, every time you get an extra one of those, you're generating more shards to promote the gears that you want to play with.
Mm-hmm. And as far as getting the better gears, there's not a lot of secret to it, right? A lot of them are going to be like multiplayer rewards, the gear sets that you can get in Survivor. There's a really low chance of getting them in the packs for some, right?
Yeah.
For a couple. And there's nothing special that you can do to get them faster other than targeting where you want to play. So playing a lot of multiplayer when there's a multiplayer gear reward, or playing a lot of Survivor in general. I think the only way that you could get them at a higher rate is if you're specifically looking for the ones that are in Survivor.
Right.
And obviously, like, spending all your time playing Survivor as opposed to anything else is the only, like, specific way to get more legendary gears.
And if you're not averse to cheating a little bit, then use the airplane mode glitch to re-roll when you spend your last laugh tickets and you don't get the gear that you want.
If you get like 20 or whatever, and then in that 20 making like resetting until you get the one that you like, or some medium to large number of tickets.
I think the best use of your time, if you're going to be resetting last laugh tickets, is if you get a significant number, and I guess you have to decide for yourself what's considered significant. If you get a significant number of critical chance and critical damage augmentations, even if you don't get the gear that you want, don't re-roll. Save those. If you do both at the same time, you're going to find yourself wasting a lot less time resetting and re-rolling, trying to cash out different last laugh tickets.
So there we go.
Yeah, well, and I guess it's implied, and every once in a while I catch myself because there's things that we take for granted because we know, is that if you play long enough, when you get the chase gear out of the set, because it's so uncommon, once you've gotten that, then you don't need any more of them. So if you're playing the long haul in the short term early on, you want that gear because it's faster payoff. But what you also want is all the critical augmentation, so don't ignore that.
And I guess the other piece of advice too is that if you're ever playing Survivor, when you already have the gear set, if what you're doing is looking for the legendary gear, then you can stop spending. And you can bank all your tickets until the next thing comes around that you actually want. And then that's the time where you're still not ignoring the crit chance and crit damage augments, but you can do another cycle where you're looking for both that and the gear that you want at the same time.
Right.
Yeah. So even if the current thing in Survivor is not the gear set you want, if you're specifically just looking for the higher star gear cards and that's your primary thing, or if you want a specific set, start banking now so that whenever it comes around, you don't need to have time during that period of time, that a lot of the work is already done ahead of time, so you're ready to just cash in.
So you're spending your time cashing the tickets instead of playing to get more tickets. Right.
Yeah.
Got it.
So there we go. We've got a good chunk of politics-related questions coming up, so just a heads up for anybody who's looking out for that. Our first one, and for a little while we're going to be responding to stuff from Drake Pendragon, who says, if people want to avoid Asian-run businesses, that is a personal choice. Just as I believe that choosing to go to a business based on the skin color of the owner is illogical, I go to businesses that are the best at what they do, regardless of the owner's race.
Yeah, it's an interesting argument to say that it's a personal choice because, let's face it, racism is also a personal choice.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't make it any less wrong. And so this was originally answering, maybe we'll quote from it earlier, but this was originally answering a question or a comment about how Pelosi said go to Chinatown, comparing that and contrasting that to Trump limiting just foreign nationals from China. So here's the thing. Avoiding Chinese restaurants in North America was a racist personal choice.
Yeah.
Doesn't make it any less racist just because it's a personal choice. It was irrational because North American Chinese restaurants were not at any greater risk than other restaurants. And it was irrational and racist because these same people avoiding Chinese restaurants or spitting on ethnically Chinese people or spitting on people who looked like they might have been Chinese.
Yeah.
They weren't doing that to Italians or avoiding Italian restaurants where really, for Canada at least, and maybe North America, I think tracing the genetic strains of the virus, the largest number of COVID-19 cases were being imported to North America from Italy.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, like, we agree that, like, going to a restaurant was a personal choice, but none of what anybody was saying was, like, the government wasn't mandating that more people go to Chinese restaurants, right? There was nobody who was actually doing anything other than giving people personal recommendations and having them, trying to get them to make more informed personal choices.
Right.
Which I think is totally reasonable.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so then this sort of leads us into the next question very naturally, or the next comment from Drake, which is, it is reasonable to stop people who are not citizens from entering the U.S. Obviously, he didn't want to stop Americans from returning home. President Trump wasn't barring Americans who were Chinese from coming back to the U.S. There are many non-Chinese Americans that conduct business in China. The research shows us that the virus was started in China. The first known case of the COVID virus came from the Wuhan district in China.
Yeah. So maybe that's important, right? Because you've got these two different ideas that are in conflict with each other. One is you want to keep the idea of a quarantine or isolating is you want to keep other people safe from the infection.
Yeah.
And the conflicting idea is that you want to make sure that people who belong in this case, the U.S., or for us, Canada, they get to come home because, you know, they were caught through no fault of their own in a situation that was quickly overtaken.
You don't want people stuck somewhere without any access to all of their resources.
Right. But they're not either or. There's not one thing that you can pick and that's it. You don't have to ban people. You can enforce a strict quarantine. And I'll say it wasn't just Trump, right, for the U.S. Ontario, our province, also did a poor job of quarantining people that were coming back. In contrast to, say, the east coast of Canada, where they did a really great job.
Yeah.
And they made sure that when you came into their provinces, you had a place that you were supposed to be going where you could actually quarantine. It wasn't enough to just say, oh, you should quarantine yourself and just let you go. They were actually following up with people, checking in on them. And I think there were some countries even where they were putting GPS bracelets on people to make sure that they weren't leaving the place they were supposed to be quarantining.
I had a friend who came back recently, and there's been like no follow-up on where they're quarantining or anything. Right. And it's not communicated well. There's no system in place. There's no, it's basically just honor system.
Yeah.
For making sure that people, do good. And, you know, at least you need to have negative COVID tests now, to come back in initially. But, you know, that only works so far. And you having a negative COVID test is great until one person slips by. And then there was that news article recently that there was a bunch of flights, I think they were Air Canada flights, where there were people who later were found to have had COVID on the planes.
Right.
And so, you know, when you're in a big box where the air is all recirculating, all it takes is one person getting in and then later turning out to have COVID to make an entire plane's worth of people go from, you know, almost certainly safe to like a huge risk factor.
Oh, okay. So now that we've started talking about this, maybe I do want to make a comment about something I just saw in the news. Apparently there's some sort of bigwig rich guy who's making $10 million a year running some casino organization.
Yeah.
Married to a wife who's, I don't know, at least 20 years younger than him, who's an actress. And they took a flight up to the Yukon so that they could pretend that they worked at a hotel nearby so they could get the vaccine. and jump the queue.
Oh, yeah,
because
I saw
there's a
that.
queue. Yeah. And so, yeah, so I think there's definitely a lot of people who are really selfish, and that goes hand in hand with what you were just saying, because what made me think of that was that there are people who are taking risks. They're not following quarantine. They are putting other people at risk because they're too selfish to limit what they do.
Yeah.
Like that, and this is sort of the extreme case where not only are they too selfish, but they're actively jumping the line and potentially taking the vaccine for somebody else who is a higher priority.
Yeah, so in terms of letting back Americans into the U.S., I agree that you want to, that there's a lot of people who have a good reason to be able to cross the border for one reason or another, right? What I think the practical concerns are is once they're here, what are you going to do with them to make sure that they're not making the problem worse? And before anybody comes in at all, how are you going to figure out who gets to come in, right? Yeah. And those go hand in hand, because the more people you're letting in, the more you have to be able to upscale whatever process you're doing to keep people in. So, for example, there's universities, right? When they're letting in international students back, they've done a variety of different things. Some campuses would do batch testing where they test the entire campus, every couple weeks. Mm-hmm. And so they'd be able to have people living on residence, and they'd have within the sort of community life being relatively normal, right? Yeah. There's most places, aren't letting anybody party anymore. If you're on residence, you're still not allowed to have groups. You still have to obey proper COVID guidelines. And there's places where when international students are coming in, especially first-year students who've already purchased residence, there will be like a hotel that the school has organized for, and that people will quarantine for 2 weeks in the hotel. They'll have meals brought to them, and they basically have like a care package and like a full kit set up so that they get to live in full quarantine in a way that is managed not by the individual. It's not left up to a single person to do whatever they want to do, where it's managed by the institution, where they go, you're not allowed to leave. We're going to bring you your meals. You're going to stay in this room. And they lay out exactly how things are going to go down. And so stuff like that is a really practical way of bringing people in, right? And you don't need to be like a Canadian citizen for the cases that I'm talking about, because I think most of them that I'm aware of are in Canada, although I think Cambridge University in the US was one of the batch testing schools. So that's a totally practical solution for universities. But you can't scale that. You can't scale that past a certain point. So you can't let everybody move, because the more people you let move, the more groups of people you say, yeah, you guys can come in, the less control you have over what any one person is doing. And so the main issue when Trump just banned China is that it's the same thing with a lot of the ineffective security measures that they have at airports, where it's the theater of it, where people are worried about the virus. They know it comes from China. And so they say, okay, well, don't worry. Nobody else is coming in from China, except for U.S. citizens. And that doesn't actually address the issue so much as addresses some people's fears.
So, yeah. And I want to just be very careful, right? He didn't actually ban China. That's sort of the point I'm trying to make is what he banned was Chinese foreign nationals. And he banned non-Americans, right? So if you break it down really simple, who's at risk of bringing the virus into a country?
Everybody.
Anybody who's been in the area where it's circulating. So it's not just American people. So the difference is everybody is a danger. However, some of those people who are dangerous, you have conflicting reasons for wanting to repatriate them, for wanting to bring them into the country. Yeah. And you brought up a good example. It's not just necessarily citizens. Some of them are not citizens. Universities, people who are paying tuition and keeping the university solvent, right? I mean, it's not controversial to say that some of the universities depend on the money coming in from foreign students. Yeah. So they have motivation to bring them in. And so on the same sort of, from that same perspective, the government's going to want to make allowances for these particular situations. So it's not that that somehow the citizens are somehow better. They're not. They're just as infectious.
Yeah.
You just have a reason for doing something different than just keeping them out. That's really it. And then you got to figure out what are you going to do with these people that you want to prioritize to let them in and be careful and keep everybody safe, because the easier part is just keep them out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that was the main issue, which is that, like, if you were giving resources to U.S. citizens who were stranded other places, right? If you were finding some way of allowing them to stay somewhere else, right? Because you decided that it was worth that money to keep new people from, or not new people, but keeping people who are spending time outside the country from coming into the country. That's fine. If you were bringing people in and you were doing, taking appropriate measures to make sure that they are not spreading COVID into the communities, that's fine. What's not great is making really targeted decisions that aren't actually impactful in a meaningful way, or aren't impactful enough. I guess because any amount of you can't come in is helpful in reducing COVID spread.
Right.
Right? Literally, anybody you leave out is going to do some good.
Right.
Right? But it's also, there's the idea of doing some good and doing enough, where if you're not hitting that threshold, obviously, too many people were let back into the U.S., right? Or too many people were allowed to come into the U.S. Too much spread was allowed to happen. And that's, from outside into the U.S., that's between communities in the U.S. We've had the same problem in Canada. And Ontario specifically has been terrible. And so the problem really is that the decisions being made, or that were being made by Trump, didn't actually address underlying issues enough to fix things.
Right. It was a half-assed measure.
Yeah.
Is really it.
And so they did something, but they did not do enough.
So I think it's fair to criticize that, right? Because it just wasn't particularly effective.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then later he tried to claim that, like, he was the person who, like, knew earliest, like, before the World Health Organization exactly what to do.
So, again, he might have known. I mean, we're seeing some things saying that there's documentation that the things that he knew were different than the things that he was claiming at the time.
Yeah.
About how it would just go away. It was no big deal. And so we can't really argue about what was going on in his head, but we can argue with what he was saying. And at the time, what he was saying was, we'll take these measures, which I think, at least between the two of us, we can agree weren't enough. And
well, I mean, if they were enough, COVID would not be the same level of issue. I think we've seen from other countries that if you have enough access to resources and enough external motivation, places that don't have infrastructure for things have been able to do things a lot better. And hindsight, obviously, is makes it really easy to say, well, you just should have done exactly this. But there's been a lot of better models for what to do that Ontario and a lot of different places in Canada and the US did not take when they still were able to take them, when they still had the time, when the numbers are still in a place where it would have been useful to. There's been a bunch of people who've done better things that we should and could have been looking towards that we did not use as models.
This is the same underlying problem that is universal to any kind of preventative measures or preventative care, is that if you do it right, it can and you people don't understand exactly what you're doing, it can feel like a waste of time.
Yeah.
Right? So if the measures had been taken, I mean, there were arguments at the time when the measurements got really strict about whether it was worth doing. And again, in retrospect, we can see that if we'd taken those measures earlier, we would have done a better job. But until something actually fails, a lot of people won't get a sense of why it's important to do it. And sometimes you can't just do that. You can't let the failure happen because it can be catastrophic.
The value of preventative measures is much less clear, but proportionally, it is also much cheaper.
But this is the same reason why you end up with security theater, right? Like, you get people doing stuff because it makes them feel good. It makes them think that something's happening. And it's still the same problem, right? If without a good understanding of what's happening, different people who are guided by the way they feel about stuff, about what they think is going to be helpful, influences what actually happens. Yeah,
and there isn't no value to doing things for the purposes of making people feel better. I think like modulating and mitigating cultural anxiety about stuff is important.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I think that actually is a really important measure. The issue, and I've been looking at research about this recently, for one of my classes, is that emotional regulation is a double-edged sword. And in a bunch of different contexts, emotional regulation is helpful for personal and subjective well-being, but it can undermine your affective, and affect is like, same thing, emotional state. It
So
can undermine
affect is
your affective,
how you demonstrate your emotional
feel.
state.
No,
Well,
affect is how you feel.
No, affect is how you look like you feel, and your emotion is actually what's inside. So affect is how you present to the world. So if you have a sad affect, you look sad. If your emotions are actually what you feel and what you can tell people about. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So but it undermines your motivation to change the environment. So if people are worried about stuff not being safe, right? And you say, well, here are all the measures that we're taking, and you have measures that don't do enough but make people feel better, then if you make people feel better, they're also going to be less concerned about actually taking measures that count.
Right.
And you're not going to be able to drum up support for that. And so the problem too is that with a lot of these things, we talked about security theater, we talked about banning China, is that there's an underlying racially motivated component of that. So the people that you're making less nervous are you're sort of reinforcing the idea that China and that foreign Chinese people are the issues.
Right.
With security theater, a lot of what that was is there's a huge amount of like anti-Muslim sentiment. Right. So you have stuff that makes people feel better, which has some value, but it makes people less motivated to sort of critically examine what actually would make the situation better, which is what we saw with COVID and what we saw with security theater. And when there is an underlying butt of the joke, when there's an underlying group that is picking up the tab, that is paying the price for making everybody else feel safer, which is, Chinese people in this case, and in security theater Muslims, you end up having a group of people whose situation is worsened in order to make some other people feel better, and for everybody to ignore a problem which actually does need to be addressed in a different way.
All right, I had not even thought about it until you started talking like this, but the perfect analogy to this is when police get blinders, they believe somebody committed a murder, they railroad this person into jail, and so on the one hand, there is the harm that befalls this one person who is innocent. On the other hand, there's still a murder at large. There's two bad things happening there.
Yeah.
Right? So there's two groups that are actually being harmed. You try to make everybody feel better by saying, oh yeah, we caught the murderer. This person gets harmed because they're in jail or on death row or they're executed. Yeah. And all these other people are made to feel better unnecessary, or it's not unnecessarily, but they're made to feel better despite the fact they're still in danger because whoever committed the murder is still out.
Yeah, they're just alleviating their anxiety about the situation. They're not actually removing the underlying reason they feel that way. And so that's the interesting thing about the research that I was reading, is they were looking at, like, in the workplace, how cognitive reappraisal, which is an emotional regulation strategy, can make people feel better, can diffuse tension in the workplace, and can reduce conflict. But how it also increases willingness to use and like instances of like counterproductive behavior, where if people don't those sort of self-reflective and social emotions oftentimes actually do serve a practical purpose, and they might feel bad to experience, but they're adaptive, they're useful emotions to experience because they motivate change. And so that's the problem. Just a second sort of layer problem, other than the fact that it didn't do enough work, and other than the fact that it was racist, is that putting up a half-assed change that you can sell to a lot of people, that will make people not look for the real, proper, actual change that needs to happen, and it makes people complacent.
Right. It's probably worth going back to the original statement. I mean, we spent so much time sort of addressing it a roundabout way, because the original statement from Drake was, what is funny is that when President Trump shut down travel from China because of the virus, Biden and Nancy Pelosi insulted him and told people to go to Chinatown.
Yeah.
And on the face of it, that might seem like a contradiction, right? To criticize Trump for how he handled travel and not criticize Pelosi for saying go to Chinatown, but it isn't. I'm hoping that it seems more obvious now, right? Because the travel ban restrictions weren't really, and ban is in air quotes, they really weren't a ban because it was letting a whole lot of people who were vectors coming in, and avoiding North American Chinatown or avoiding North American Chinese was not based on anything helpful because it's really just racist. There's no connection. The North American Chinese restaurants weren't sort of in dens of iniquity full of people from Wuhan who were carrying.
It's like there's this huge like gangster like mob bust or something happening, and then people go, okay, well, you can't eat at Italian restaurants for a little while, right? It's not relevant. It's just sort of coincidental that these people belong to the same cultural group. But the real thing that matters there is geography. And, COVID doesn't care, like, what your race is in terms of who's catching it. There is a racial bias in who's most negatively affected by it. Especially in the U.S., Black people are way more severely impacted by COVID because they have less access to healthcare. They have less ability to social distance in many cases. There's differences in social economic status means that people are being forced to work jobs where they have more exposure potentially. But in terms of actually getting the virus itself, it doesn't matter what race you are.
And it's not even the U.S., right? It's true in Canada. I work in an area where the burden is the highest, the bad outcomes is the highest, where it's really affected people, and it's people, again, like you said, people of color, people who are marginalized, low socioeconomic status, people who have to work because they have no choice. It's not the people who are best able to avoid things by working from home and from lockdown in general, not all of them, but in general, tend to be more middle class, to have more money, to have more resources, have more supports.
And the worst part too is that the people who are at most risk to get sick are the people who can least afford to get sick.
Right. Well, this is the thing, right? Like I think, but even before the pandemic, we were pretty clear. I remember being pretty clear about how two of the things that Ford did that were really bad were canceling the last bump in minimum wage and revoking the 2 paid sick days that had been introduced by Kathleen Wynne.
Yeah.
So what we're really seeing now is the harm in that, because not only is that a financial disincentive for people to stay at home, you don't make money, you don't have paid sick days, you're going to not be able to pay your bills, then people are more motivated to want to keep on working when they're sick. Mm-hmm. And minimum wage being so low, in specifically and in general, personal support workers being paid so poorly, meant that it was impossible for them to only work part-time at one place, as opposed to moving to different long-term care facilities and again potentially spreading the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So there we go. Do you have any other final points? I think I wanted to say.
Yeah, because it's the reason why I feel like this was an interesting thing to take on was these are kind of talking points that are pretty common. Like you hear them, and it takes a little bit more of a nuanced discussion to really sort of get at the meat of why it's a bit problematic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there we go. And there's one last comment from Jake Pendragon here, which is Oriental just refers to anything from the Orient, and then in brackets, the Orient is a term for the East, traditionally comprising anything that belongs to the Eastern world in relation to Europe.
This is more a fundamental kind of thing, right? Like Oriental, like Drake says, it's a Western term.
Yeah.
And so what you're doing with Oriental, like you're lumping together a bunch of people who might look similar to people who don't have a discerning eye, whose cultures might seem exotic. And that's where the racism comes in, because you're lumping together Japanese, Korean, Chinese, Vietnamese, maybe Filipino, maybe, Taiwanese.
Mm-hmm.
And what I always think better in analogies. To me, it's very much why it's racist to say that the people who are native to northern Canada are Eskimos when they call themselves the Inuit.
Yeah.
Eskimo, I think, was a word that was something like raw meat eaters.
Eater of raw meat.
Eater of raw meat.
Yeah.
So when you decide what you're going to call somebody, and they've told you, this is very much the same discussion you have with people's pronouns and stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
When you decide that you're going to call people something else when they've told you who they are,
Yeah.
that's a little bit racist.
Yeah. And the problem is that there's a lot of words that just mean something, but have derogatory connotations from when they were used. And obviously, I can't use most of those words as examples because they are some amount of slurs. And I think Oriental is one of the terms that can be used in some contexts when you're not referring to people that isn't...
That's acceptable.
That isn't as bad. And there is... Yeah, but you talk about slurs for gay people, right? There's a lot of words that just mean gay. Right? That you can't use. And when you talk about talking about Native American people, right? So there's a lot of words there that you also can't use. And Native American people is a good example, because you can't refer to Native American people as Indians is bad for a lot of reasons,
right?
But one of the reasons that it's bad, and one of the reasons that actually Native American people doesn't quite get around, is that they aren't a group, right? They're not in any sense other than the fact that they live in the same geographical area. They're not a single unified group. The way that they organize themselves was a bunch of independent tribes, a bunch of independent small groups of people who had strong interpersonal bonds between them. But if you bring somebody from one tribe together with somebody from another tribe, saying, oh, well, you're both Native Americans, right? Is as useful as bringing in just two people from, different countries and saying, well, you both live on the same continent. Right. They might not speak the same language. They don't have the same cultural touchstones. They're not connected. And so you can use it as a shorthand. You can say, East Asian, right? Means almost the same thing as Oriental. Not quite. It doesn't refer to the same geographical region, but it's a similar...
Well, it doesn't elide the fact that you're not... Well, I guess what it does is, when you go geographically at least, it acknowledges the fact that you're grouping people together from the general area of the world where they are, and not because they have something that looks to you very similar. Like, it's a whole different thing where you're centering yourself by calling people Oriental, as opposed to looking at the location and saying East Asian.
Mm-hmm. But so the main issue with talking about the Orient is that it does have a lot of cultural connotations. It does mean something different. And it's not, even in general, like even just saying East Asian, the only time that it's useful is when you can't be more specific. And that's the same issue with Native American, which is if you're referring to somebody, I wouldn't say that I'm, if somebody asks where I'm from, I wouldn't say North America and then stop there. I would say Canada. I would specify, and I would specify to the level, or if I was talking to somebody who is from Montreal, I would say Ontario. Right? Where you want to be as specific as you can be with an individual. If somebody asked me where I was from, I would never say the Americas. Right?
Yeah. That's a good one.
So when you have that information, you can refer to people as East Asian. But if what you mean is Chinese people, say Chinese people. Right? I can refer to somebody as Native American, but if they come from a specific tribe, if there's a subdivision of culture that is relevant to them, and that is the sort of important cultural signifier, be specific. Use the group that's going to make sense for the context that you're talking about them in. And I think just Oriental is never a group that is actually what you should be talking about, because Oriental food isn't a real thing. Right?
Yeah.
Any more than European food is a real thing.
Because it's funny how historically, say, in that area of the world, Japan was hated for so long because they were colonizing everybody else. They were coming around, raping and pillaging other countries. There's a huge amount of historical animosity that Chinese, Koreans, maybe Vietnamese, I'm not sure, have for the Japanese because of all the stuff that they did that was just so awful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it's just, there's more cultural meaning there than just what it technically means, right? Because I think, I can't think of any exceptions. Maybe I'm just not thinking of the right slurs, but I think almost every slur, if you break it down to what it's just its functional, literal meaning is, it just means a group of people. And it's just a word that some people used to use to refer to a group of people. And there was connotations, it was used in really hateful ways. But if you just break it down to its barest meaning, it just means,
Right, so there's bad connotations, but it's also not a useful term.
Yeah.
It's a combination of things, right? And a good example of where something gets taken over by its connotations, I think, is the swastika that was taken over by the Nazis.
Yeah.
It didn't always represent the Nazis. I think it had some sort of meaning in Indian culture, right?
It predates the Nazis by a lot, yeah.
Yeah, but the problem was...
I think it's Buddhist.
Is it Buddhist?
I'm not 100% sure.
I should have looked this up before I started. Yeah, but I just thought it occurred to me now to make that analogy, to draw that line, is that the problem is sometimes that the wrong kind of movements can co-opt specific symbols or terms or whatever, and then you sort of have to adjust on the fly. I mean, nobody's going to make the argument now that somehow because it didn't originally mean that, and because the Nazis co-opted it, that we can go back to using swastikas and try to pretend that it doesn't mean what it does now.
And there's space for movement and change. Like, the term queer, right? Was originally not a term that was appropriate. It fell out of use because it did have negative connotations, and now it's being used actually as an acceptable umbrella term. So, it's possible that one day people are going to be okay with using Oriental as a signifier. It's not to say that it has to be this way forever, just the way that it is right now.
But it has to be reclaimed.
Yeah.
It can't, if the group involved is not, like, the term queer is a good one, right?
Yeah.
It's because it was reclaimed in order to take away the power of that term to harm.
Yeah.
And if there's no movement to reclaim it, I don't think you're getting anywhere with it.
And then there's also reclaiming it for the group themselves and reclaiming it as a general use term, where queer is one of the few examples of it being reclaimed, I think, a lot more generally, where, LGBTQ, right? Or to be more specific, I think it's LGBTQ2S, which is what we should be saying in Canada, recognizing Two-Spirit, yeah.
Right.
But the Q is there, and that's meant to be commonly used. An example along the same lines of words that are being reclaimed that still aren't really great for people to use outside that context is slurs for lesbian woman. It's a word beginning with D, dy. I'm not going to say the full word because it's on its way to being a little more sort of generally acceptable, but it's a word that's being reclaimed right now by lesbians for lesbians, and not for your average dude on the street.
Right.
Which is why I'm not saying it.
Right.
Yeah.
So we're actually out of footage. We still got a couple more questions. We're going to keep it short this week, so maybe we'll save those for next week.
So there we go. We'll wrap up here with all of our thank yous. First off, I'd like to give a shout out to Eliza Cynthia Caton. She's trying to get back into slam poetry. This shout out was brought to you by Eliza, who's actually written out a couple of these again, so I can work from her suggestions now. And now that she's listened to them all, has a better sense of
what we
do? Type of stuff that I would be saying.
Yeah, no, so this is hers?
This is hers, yeah.
Oh, cool. Okay.
Not bad. And we'd also like to give a thank you to everybody who supports us on Patreon.
And that would be Consul Peasant and Edwoon at the top tier last word, Mohammed Albshaiti at the Your Message Here tier, Shawn Farrell, Daniel Simonson, Aaron Maule, Michael DeVries, Brandon C., Irvin Ruiz, and Eddydoo, who are supporting us on the credited level, and Chris Wolf, Scarlett Danny, Awesome Gamer 2for1, Pavu RS, Gavin Malott, and Isfar E at the gratitude level.
There you go. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time.
Komoda.